Hi friends, tonight let us step quietly back in time, into the snow-wrapped silence of a long-forgotten age. This is a tale not of battles or kings, but of winters, and why they were feared more than war itself. In this first chapter, we begin with a gentle walk through the villages and valleys of medieval Europe, just as the first frost begins to fall. This is the opening of a story that will slowly unwrap the ancient truths hidden in the stillness of the coldest season, when survival was uncertain and hope clung to the firelight. So wrap yourself in a warm blanket, dear listener. Let your breathing slow. The tale begins. The world was dimming early. The sun, once bold, now slipped behind the hills before the day had truly ripened. The shadows of late autumn crept longer over the thatched roofs and narrow lanes of the village of Wythicombe, where every soul was beginning to brace for the coming of winter. Not the crisp, fleeting chill of modern Decembers, but a devouring season, deep, merciless, and long. In this tiny village, nestled within the folds of a valley in 14th century England, time was measured by the elements. Men did not wear watches, but watched the sky, the colour of the dawn, the shape of the clouds, the cry of the ravens on the frost-stiff trees, all whispered clues to what lay ahead. And now, all signs spoke of an early and bitter winter. A small boy named Ansel, no more than 9 winters old, crouched beside his grandfather's chair in the smoky gloom of their cottage. He watched the old man mend a pair of worn leather boots by firelight. Sparks hissed as the hearthwood shifted, casting momentary golden light on the walls of daub and wattle. Outside, a thin skin of frost glazed the soil, and the hens had long since gone silent. Ansel's grandfather, Osric, had seen more winters than most men dared. His back was bent, not with age alone, but from years spent carving the earth, coaxing barley from stone-laced fields. He knew what was coming, though he did not speak of it aloud. "You'll need your boots, lad," he murmured, holding one sole up to the light and nodding with satisfaction. "This will be a cruel one." And he was right. Medieval winters were. Not the powdered postcard scenes of sleigh rides and cosy cheer we now imagine. They were seasons of endurance, of breath made visible in the freezing air, of cold that gnawed at bones even indoors. Few households had enough wood. Fewer still had enough food. The cold was not only outside, it moved in, took up residence, in hearths and corners, crept into the joints of the old and the lungs of the weak. In Wythicombe, winter began before snow ever touched the ground. It began with silence. Birds that once darted through hedgerows were gone, flown south or perished. Streams grew sluggish under sheaths of ice. The livestock, vital to a family's survival, grew restless, their hooves cracking against frozen ground. And in every cottage, there was that same lingering dread, not spoken aloud, but felt, in the weight of every footstep, the cautious rationing of oats, the careful gathering of moss and bark to stretch the dwindling stores of firewood. Even the church bell sounded colder. Food was the truest fear. No matter how devout or hardy the people of Wythicombe were, no prayer could summon back the greens of summer or the rich grains of autumn. Root cellars were packed with turnips and leeks, but always with the question, would it last? Ansel's mother, a pale and soft-spoken woman named Edith, spent her evenings bent over the pot above the hearth, stretching broth with herbs and bark. She'd smile at Ansel and say, "Soon, lad, the light will return." But in her eyes, there was the question no one asked aloud. Would they all be here to see it? Medieval people lived close to death, but in winter, death lived closer to them. Fevers festered in close quarters. Childbirth, already dangerous, became nearly impossible when the midwife's hands trembled with cold and water froze before it, boiled. Many simply did not wake one morning, lost to the chill in the night. Yet somehow, life still moved within the stillness. Children chased each other with frozen breath puffing before them, pretending to be dragons. Old men gathered in the tavern, swapping tales warmed by ale and memory. Women spun wool with red cracked fingers, humming songs their mothers had sung before them, and stories. Stories lived even when crops failed and pipes burst. Stories were warmth when firewood ran out. They wrapped around families like extra blankets, wove colour into grey days, and offered glimpses of light when all the windows were dark with frost. That winter in Withcombe was beginning to unfurl its full strength, and in the coming weeks it would test the heart and soul of every villager. But on this first night, as Ansel pressed closer to his grandfather's side and the wind sang lonely through the chimney, there was still time for one more story. Osric cleared his throat, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves, and began, "Long ago, before your father's father was born, there was a winter so fierce that the river froze solid from end to end. And so the tale wove on, soft and slow, drifting, with the smoke from the fire. Outside, the snow began to fall. The snow did not stop for days. By the 6th morning, every trail and hedgerow had vanished under a pale, unbroken sheet. Chimneys poured ribbons of smoke into a windless sky, and the world below seemed to have been swallowed by silence. In the village of Withcombe, the stillness was not peace, it was warning. Ansel stood by the narrow window, wrapped in a woolen shawl far too large for him. His breath left cloudy ghosts on the glass as he peered out. What once was a path to the village square now lay hidden beneath drifts waist-deep. Beyond that, only the distant woods showed their sharp silhouettes against the greying sky. The trees looked like skeletons. Inside the cottage, the fire had sunk to coals. Osric was still asleep, his frame lost beneath layers of patched blankets. Edith moved slowly by the hearth, stirring a pot that gave off more steam than scent. She had used the last of the onions the night before. "The turnips will keep a bit longer," she murmured, mostly to herself. The harvest that year had been thin. The summer had come late, and the rains had lingered far into September, rotting many of the root crops before they could be lifted. What little barley they had saved had already been ground into flour, and even that was stretched with dried acorns and powdered bark. In medieval times, hunger was not dramatic. It did not shout. It crept. It tightened its grip one day at a time, quietly eroding the body. And it came, inevitably, every winter. Each household in Withcombe had its own reckoning. Some fared better, those with goats perhaps, or a pig salted in late autumn. Others bartered, or begged, or went without. Hunger shaped the bones of the people. Children grew thin and silent. Mothers stopped bleeding, not from age, but from the body's quiet surrender to scarcity. The church kept a ledger of the grain tithes, but even Father Elric had begun to stretch his sermons longer, perhaps to delay the time when he would be asked for aid he could no longer give. That day, Ansel followed his mother outside, clinging to her shawl as she trudged toward the communal granary. Snow clung to every surface. The trees creaked like old doors. Edith's breath rasped in her throat. The granary, a simple timber structure with a thatched roof, was locked by an iron bar. Inside lay sacks of grain collected from the villagers during the harvest. It was meant for times such as these, but always, always with caution. As Edith waited by the gate, a heavy-set man named Reeve Morlan approached. He was the village reeve, the king's man, and the keeper of the stores. His beard was stiff with frost, and his expression was weary. "I can give you a small sack," he said, after a long pause. "No more than 3 days' worth. And you'll need to share with the Thornleys." Edith nodded, knowing better than to protest. "Thank you, Reeve." Reeve Morlan leaned close, lowering his voice. "There are rumours from the next village. Frost-bitten cattle. A family lost in the hills. Don't stray far, Edith." She said nothing, only clutched the sack tighter and turned back toward their home. Ansel followed, his boots crunching through the snow. The sky hung low, a soft iron dome above them. Inside again, Edith measured out the flour with a careful hand, mixing it with melted snow and crushed dried nettles. The dough made no pretense of bread, more a paste, baked on a flat stone by the fire. Still, it was food. and they would eat. That evening, Osric woke from his sleep with a cough that racked his chest. He sat upright, blinking at the fire. "The cold's deeper this year," he muttered. "Colder than when I was a lad. Do you remember how you made it through?" Edith asked, not looking up from her work. The old man was quiet a long time. Then he said, "We didn't. Not all of us." There it was, the truth so rarely spoken. Medieval winters were not measured only in frost, but in loss. The harvest could never truly prepare them. No matter how much was stored, nature took more. In years past, when the Great Famine struck in the early 1300s, entire villages disappeared. Chroniclers wrote of mothers abandoning their children in forests, hoping perhaps a nobleman might find them. Of men eating the bark from trees, the leather from their shoes, of fields filled with nothing but silence. Though Whitcomb was spared, those extremes, for now, the memory lived in its people's bones. They felt it in every hollow belly, every brittle branch. That night, as Ansel lay beside his grandfather, he whispered, "Will it get better soon?" Osric looked down at him. The boy's cheeks were hollowing already, and the hunger made his voice soft. "In spring," he said. "It always gets better in spring. But what if spring doesn't come?" Osric didn't answer right away. He only placed a calloused hand on Ansel's head and said gently, "Then we keep telling stories, lad, until it does." And so, with the wind sighing through the cracks in the cottage walls and the fire spitting low embers, Osric began another tale. Not of knights or kings, but of a girl who carried firelight in her pocket, and how she walked through a winter that would not end, lighting hope in every village she passed. Outside, the snow still fell. Quiet, relentless, as if the world itself had stopped to listen. The fire, though small, was everything. In medieval Whitcomb, a hearth was not merely the heart of the home, it was its lifeblood. From the moment the sun dipped beneath the hills to the first faint glimmer of dawn, it held back the hunger and cold that waited at every door. No matter how thin the stew or how brittle the wind, as long as there were embers, there was hope. Ansel had grown fascinated by the way his grandfather coaxed flame from nearly nothing. Osric never wasted wood. He would crouch beside the stone hearth, laying the kindling with precision. Dry reeds first, then pine needles, then slender twigs stacked like a small cathedral. Over this he would breathe gently, his breath rising like incense until the flame caught and crackled into life. This morning, the flame was weak. The pile of firewood beside the door had shrunk to just a few armfuls, and each log was more frostbitten than dry. Still, it was enough for now. Edith moved about the cottage, her fingers red from the cold, her breath misting in front of her face despite the fire. She opened a small sack of herbs and crushed them with a stone pestle. Their scent, bitter, piney, familiar, filled the air. "For the cough," she said softly, as Osric stirred in his blanket. "If the fire doesn't warm you, perhaps this will." In many homes, the hearth was more than warmth. It was medicine, kitchen, light, and prayer. Spells and blessings were often whispered into the flames. Ashes were believed to hold secrets. And above all, the smoke was sacred. It rose like a fragile thread from the earth to the heavens, binding the living with the divine. On that day, the fire was shared with neighbours. By midday, 2 visitors arrived at their door. Aunt Breatha, who lived 3 cottages down, and little Ewan, a boy of 7 with a constant sniffle and wide, solemn eyes. They had run out of wood entirely, and Breatha's husband was away with the forestmen, seeking fallen trees in the deep woods. "May we warm a while?" she asked, though the answer was already understood. Ansel made space beside him, and Ewan slid in like a shadow, pulling his knees to his chest. He was too cold to speak. Osric nodded at them both, and with careful fingers, fed another sliver of wood into the fire. For the next few hours, no one spoke much. The flames did all the talking. They popped and whispered, a quiet symphony of warmth. The children watched the way the light played on the walls, flickering across the hanging herbs and worn tapestries. Shadows danced like old spirits. Edith ladled out a thin soup, no more than hot water with traces of leek and garlic, but the warmth was enough. As Breatha sipped from her wooden bowl, she gave a faint smile. "Do you remember the winter of smoke?" she asked Osric. He chuckled. "Aye, when the chimneys all clogged with soot. Half the village coughing up black clouds for weeks. I was just a girl," she said, "but I remember the air tasted like burnt meat for a month." Edith looked up. "Was it colder than this?" Osric paused. It was different. That year, it wasn't just the cold. It was the sickness. People falling like wheat before the scythe. Sickness and cold were kin. In the tight, smoky cottages of medieval villages, air was often damp, riddled with soot, and heavy with breath. Pneumonia, fevers, and the chill that gripped the chest like a vice. They were as much a part of winter as snow and wind, and when the fire weakened, so too did the lungs. "Do you know what saved us?" Osric said, eyes distant. Breatha raised a brow. "An old midwife," he replied. "Agnes the Ash. Called her that because she was always dusted head to toe in soot. She made something, a drink, with dried mushrooms and birch bark. Didn't taste like much, but it warmed the belly and cleared the lungs." Edith perked up. "Do you remember what went in it?" Osric shrugged. "It's in the smoke now. Maybe it'll come back." Ansel leaned closer to the fire. "Did she live long?" "She lived long enough to see 3 more winters," Osric said, "which was longer than most." As the day wore on and the snow softened against the windows, Ewan finally spoke. "Can the fire go out?" Edith turned to him, her voice gentle. "Only if we let it." And that was the truth of it. Fire in a medieval home was never left unattended. Even at night, someone stirred to tend it, to poke it, to feed it just enough to keep its heart alive. It was not only warmth, it was survival. That evening, Breatha and Ewan stayed. There was no safe way home through the deepening snow, and besides, the fire was strong here. Ansel shared his blanket with Ewan, and the 2 boys curled beside the hearth, listening to the wind tap at the shutters like a forgotten guest. Osric cleared his throat and said, "Shall we have a tale?" The children nodded, already drifting into that twilight between waking and dreams. "This one," Osric began, "is about a fox who stole fire from the mountain gods and brought it to the first people. But he had to trick the winter spirits, who were guarding the flame in a cave of ice." As his voice wove through the dim room, the flames danced in time, casting golden shapes that seemed to echo the words. Outside, the storm continued its slow, steady weeping, but inside, by the breath of the hearth, there was a fragile peace, and where there was fire, there was still a chance that morning would come. The days blurred into one another, each wrapped in a white silence that made time feel still. But even in the deepest cold, there came a point when warmth must be hunted, gathered, earned. And so it was on the 8th day of snow when Osric declared that they must go to the forest's edge. "No more waiting," he said, tugging on his old woolen cloak. "We'll run out before the weekends. The woodpile's naught but splinters now." Edith nodded without argument. She had been watching the fire grow weaker each night, and though she hid her worry well, it had already begun to nest in the corners of her eyes. Ansel's heart fluttered with something between fear and excitement. The forest was a mystery, especially in winter. It loomed at the valley's edge like a silent cathedral, its trees heavy with snow, its trails hidden beneath layers of frost. But it was also their last hope. So, that morning, just past dawn, Ansel, Osric, and 2 other villagers, Wulfric the Cooper and young Merowyn, barely into his teens, set off through the snow. The wind bit at their cheeks and turned their breath to mist. Each step was a labour, the snow clinging to their boots, the weight of their empty sleds dragging behind them. The forest, when they reached it, was hushed as a crypt. Birdsong had fled, even the squirrels were hidden. Only the creak of the trees and the occasional snap of falling snow marked the passage of time. "Keep close," Osric warned. "The snow hides holes and frozen streams. It would take little to lose a foot, or worse." Ansel nodded, gripping the rope of the sled tightly. In medieval winters, the forest was both providence and peril. It offered fuel, food, even medicine, but it also hid wolves, and in some years, bandits or desperate folk turned wild by hunger. Every venture into the trees was a gamble. They searched first for fallen limbs, trees brought low by storms or age. Cutting live wood was frowned upon unless one owned the land or held the Lord's favour. But dead wood was a gift. Wulfric, broad-shouldered and silent, spotted the first treasure. An ash tree split by wind, its dry limbs tangled in the underbrush. Osric nodded with grim approval and set to work with his hatchet, each strike echoing through the trees like a slow drum. Mirowin, shivering beside Ansel, whispered, "My Dar says the trees remember who cuts them." Ansel blinked. "What does that mean?" "He says if you take more than you need, the forest takes something back." Ansel looked around at the towering trunks, their limbs heavy with white. He didn't laugh. In winter, even the youngest knew not to tempt old stories. The hours passed in quiet toil. The boys hauled branches to the sleds while the men cut and trimmed. Fingers ached, faces burned with cold. But there was satisfaction too, a sense of doing what must be done. The forest did not give freely, but it gave enough. Near midday, they paused. Osric passed out dried apples, leathery and sweet, and a skin of watered ale. They sat on a fallen log, their breath swirling upward into the high silence of the trees. Wulfric finally spoke. "Do you remember the frostbite winter? The one where the miller lost both feet?" Osric nodded. "'Twas 20 years past. Snow came early and never left. The river froze so solid you could ride a cart over it." "I was just a boy," Wulfric murmured. "Thought it would never end." Osric looked at the boys. "And yet, here we are." After the brief rest, they resumed. Merowyn ventured deeper toward a grove of birches and called back, "There's more here! Dry branches!" Ansel followed, heart quickening. The snow was deeper here, past his knees, but the branches were good, light, dry, easy to break, and then a sound. Low, distant, but distinct. A howl. Not one of the wind, but something beneath it. Long, mournful, filled with hunger. Merowyn froze. "Wolf," he whispered. Osric and Wulfric came running, axes in hand, eyes sweeping the trees. "Gather. Fast," Osric said. "We're done here." The pace quickened. Branches thrown onto sleds, ropes tied hastily, breath short and sharp. The howl came again, closer now, not just one. Ansel's chest pounded. He clutched the sled rope and followed Osric's wide. Steps back through the forest, the sound of snow crunching behind him like approaching footsteps. Wolves were no myth in winter. Hunger made them bold. In bad years, they came near the village, watching from the shadows, and in the deep woods, where few dared go, they ruled. But this time, perhaps the gods of the forest were merciful. No grey shapes appeared, no teeth flashed from the shadows. They made it back to the village as the sun kissed the hills, dragging their precious wood behind them. The snow behind them remained undisturbed. The only signs of life were the long paths they had carved through the white. Back, at the cottage, Edith ran out to meet them, cheeks flushed, relief in her eyes. She helped Ansel inside, pulling off his boots, rubbing his frozen fingers between her own. "You did well," she said softly. "You all did." That night, the fire burned higher. The scent of wood smoke rose sweet and full, filling the small home with a comfort no stew could match. Osric sat back in his chair, a mug of warmed ale in his hands. "I think the forest forgave us," he said with a wink. Ansel, curled up with a blanket by the hearth, asked, "What would have happened if it hadn't?" Osric stared into the fire for a long moment, then replied, "Then this tale would have ended differently, lad." And no one spoke after that, just the fire and the wind and the long breath of the night. It began with a cough. At first, no one paid it much mind. Osric had always coughed now and then, especially in the mornings, when the cold clung to the walls like damp fingers. But on the 11th day of snow, the cough deepened. It hollowed, it rattled, and then it lingered, as if something unseen had nested within his chest. Edith listened as he struggled through the night, propped upright by pillows of bundled straw. The fire burned low, its light flickering like a pulse. She placed a hand on Osric's forehead and drew it back sharply. "Fever," she whispered. In the medieval world, illness was rarely met with calm. Disease struck silently and quickly, often without warning, and winter was its most faithful companion. Cold weakened the body, dampness seeped into the lungs, and when fever arrived, it was like watching a candle gutter in the wind. No way to tell whether it would flare again or go out forever. By morning, Osric could no longer rise. Ansel sat beside him, wide-eyed, chewing at the frayed edge of his sleeve. "Will he die?" he asked in a voice so small it barely stirred the air. Edith looked at her son, her lips thin, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "Not if I can help it." But the truth was, in Withcombe, as in all of medieval England, help was scarce. There were no hospitals, no medicines as we know them. There was the midwife, and there were herbs. There were prayers, and there was the fire. She fed Osric warm nettle tea with honey, the last in their stores. She crushed dried rosemary and laid it in a poultice across his chest. She boiled rags and steeped wild thyme in ale. Each motion was careful, practiced, desperate. Outside, the wind howled louder than before, as if echoing his pain. Word spread through the village quickly. Sickness was a signal, a warning bell no one needed to ring. Soon, Breatha came to the door again, bearing a small sack of dried rose hips. "For strength," she said. "Steep them long." "Thank you," Edith murmured, her voice brittle. Behind Breitha stood Father Elric, the priest. His robe was worn, but he still bore a quiet dignity. He stepped inside, murmured a soft prayer, and laid a hand upon Osric's brow. "He may yet mend," the priest said, "but keep him near the warmth, and do not let the air go still." He meant, of course, to keep the fire alive. For in a sick room, still air became a thief. It stole warmth, invited chill, deepened fever. Edith did not sleep that night. She fed the fire hourly, rousing Ansel when her hands trembled too much to carry the wood. The cottage walls seemed to close in, heavy with dread. Every breath Osric took was a slow battle, every cough a drumbeat of worry, and still the snow fell. Outside, the village grew quieter. People ventured out less. The well froze again. The bakery, already shuttered most days, gave no smoke that morning. Hunger was not the only fear now. Illness had come to Withcombe. Down the lane, the Thornleys' youngest, a girl named Lena, had fallen ill as well. Her mother sent a message in the hands of a boy. "Did Edith have any willow bark to trade?" "I have none," Edith replied, "but I'll come when I can." She did, that afternoon, wrapped in furs and armed with a small satchel of dried sage. Ansel stayed behind to watch over Osric, who murmured in his fever dreams of frost-covered fields and names Ansel didn't know. The Thornley home was darker than Edith's, its fire weaker, its air heavy with the scent of sickness. Lena lay curled on a straw mat, skin pale as the snow outside. Her mother, Emme, knelt beside her with red-rimmed eyes. Edith said little. She offered the sage and helped warm water for tea. They spoke of nothing beyond what was needed. In winter, there was little space for comfort, only action and waiting. Back home, the fire had gone low again. Ansel had fed it as best he could, but the wood was damp and sputtered instead of catching. He was crying silently, cheeks streaked with soot. Edith said nothing, only knelt beside the hearth and rebuilt the flame. Osric was still breathing, though each breath was now a shallow sigh. That night, Edith sang. She didn't know why. Not really. It was not something she did often, not in these hard years, but something in the flickering firelight, something in her father's fading strength, called it forth. It was a lullaby, old, older than the village itself. Words passed down through voices long lost, woven with notes that rose like smoke and settled like snow. Sleep, old wolf, the woods are wide, the snow shall be thy silent bride. The hearth shall keep the frost at bay, till golden spring finds back her way. Ansel curled beside her, listening. Osric's eyes fluttered. For the first time in 3 days, his lips moved. Not a word, not a sound, but a motion, like memory, surfacing from beneath ice. She sang until her voice cracked and the fire dimmed, and the night gave no more answers. And outside, above the white-covered world, the stars blinked, distant and unmoved. The chapel bell rang once at dawn, low, hollow, and lingering in the cold air like a breath held too long. It was not the sound of celebration, nor was it the call to daily prayer. It was the bell for the sick, and more often than not in winter, for the dying. Edith heard it through the frost-coated shutters and closed her eyes. She had heard that tone before, many winters ago, and each time it carried the same weight. It meant another name whispered to heaven, another fire grown cold, another bed unoccupied. Osric had not worsened that morning, but he had not improved. His breath was raspy, drawn like thread through thorns. His fever still clung like a ghost, but he lived, and that was more than could be said for some. Breatha came again before midday, this time with red eyes and a tight-lipped expression. She did not speak at first, only clutched Edith's arm. "Lena passed in the night," she said at last. Edith felt her knees soften, and she gripped the edge of the hearth. I thought she might last the week," Breatha murmured. She was only 8. They stood in silence, the fire snapping gently beside them. In medieval villages like Whitcomb, death did not wait for the old. It came for children, mothers, lovers, farmers, monks. It cared little for goodness or strength. And in winter, it walked with heavy steps. That afternoon, the chapel stood open. Ansel and Edith made the walk together, wrapped tightly in wool. Osric was too weak to rise, but Edith placed warm stones beside him and made sure the fire was fed before she left. It was important, she knew, to show face, to join in mourning. In Whitcomb, the chapel was not only for prayer, it was for presence. Snow crunched under their feet, brittle and unforgiving. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, but many homes remained shuttered. The wind had teeth. The chapel itself was small and plain. Stone walls, a narrow steeple, wooden pews smoothed by generations of weary hands. At the front stood Father Elric, wrapped in his winter robe, the colour of old ashes. He raised his hand in greeting. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost softer than the wind that rustled through the eaves. "We gather not only for the departed, but for ourselves," he said. "We pray that their journey is swift, and that ours is not yet ended." Villagers filled the benches slowly. No songs were sung. There was little energy for it. Instead, the names of the dead were spoken aloud. "Lena Thornley," the priest said, eyes closed. "Torvin the Thatcher," another voice whispered. "Gerwin of the Mill," and so it went. Names like feathers, falling one by one. A litany of loss. Edith sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flame that burned at the altar. It was a single candle, tall and thin, the only warmth in the room beyond the breath of those gathered. Ansel sat beside her, uncharacteristically still. His eyes wandered over the worn icons, the chipped paint of saints who had watched over 100 such winters. He didn't yet understand all of it, not fully, but he knew the sadness. He felt it in his mother's silence, in the way Breatha cried without sound. After the service, Father Elric invited them to remain. If anyone wishes to leave an offering or speak a word, the chapel will stay open through the dusk. The chapel remained a refuge in winter, not because it was warm, it rarely was, but because it was shared. In a world where survival was individual, mourning was communal. To grieve alone was a kind of second death. Ansel knelt before the altar and lit a candle with trembling fingers. "For the little girl," he said. Edith watched him, tears gathering but not falling. Later, Breatha joined them on the chapel steps. Her shoulders were hunched against the wind. "They're burying Lena tomorrow," she said. "Where?" "Behind the yew tree. The ground's too hard near the stream." "Do you want me to come?" Breatha nodded, her face shadowed. "Yes, bring the boy, if he wants." As the light faded, the three of them walked slowly back to their cottages. The snow began again, fine and gentle this time, like sifted flour. The kind of snow that looked beautiful, but still buried hope just the same. When they returned, Osric was awake. He was not better, not really, but he smiled faintly at the sight of them. "Still here," he rasped. Edith knelt beside him and kissed his forehead. "We all are, for now." That night, the fire was strong again. Its light reached every corner of the small home. They ate a thin porridge made with the last of the dried beans and a handful of oats. It filled the stomach enough. Before sleep, Ansel sat by the fire, poking it gently with a stick. "Do you think the prayers help?" he asked. Edith considered. "They help us remember. That's something." Osric coughed softly and said, "And they help us believe the cold isn't all there is." Ansel nodded slowly, then asked, "Can you tell me another story?" Osric smiled, though it was tired and faint. "Very well. One more." And so he began. There was once a monk who could speak with winter itself. He lived in a cave of ice, high in the mountains, and each year he asked the snow why it came so heavy. One year, the snow answered, and the tale spun out like a thread of gold against the dark. Outside, the snow whispered its secrets to the chapel rooftops. And inside, by firelight and memory, life clung on for one more night. The morning of Lena Thornley's burial dawned grey and still. Snow had ceased for the first time in days, leaving behind a white silence that pressed down upon the village like a heavy woolen shroud. No birds sang, no wind stirred the branches. Even the smoke rising from chimneys seemed slower, as if it mourned with them. Edith wrapped Ansel in his warmest layers, 2 cloaks, a scarf of coarse wool, and mittens stitched from scraps of old tunics. He stood quietly as she tied them snug, his face pale and solemn. "Must we go?" he whispered. Edith brushed a lock of hair from his brow. "Yes, we must say goodbye, not for her, but for those who stay." The path to the chapel graveyard had been cleared by the village men at dawn, their spades and shovels biting into frozen drifts. Each scoop revealed the earth beneath, dark, unwilling, and cold as iron. It took hours to dig the grave. The ground was hard, frozen deep, and the men had to boil water to soften the topsoil before breaking it with pickaxes. Behind the chapel, beneath the old yew tree, the grave took shape. The yew itself had stood for generations, its thick black-green branches, twisted like old hands, its roots drinking stories from the soil. In Wythcombe, no place was more sacred for burials. It was said the yew remembered every name ever whispered beneath it. Father Elric stood at the head of the grave, his hands clasped in prayer, a shawl wrapped around his shoulders against the biting air. Breatha stood nearby, her face drawn, lips pressed tight, her eyes empty from weeping. Edith and Ansel arrived just as the service began. The villagers stood in a semicircle, boots pressed deep into the snow, breath visible in the air. There were no flowers, none grew now. No music, only the quiet crunch of shifting feet and the low drone of Father Elric's voice. "We commit our sister, Lena, To the earth, he said, beneath the branches that have seen our beginnings and will see our ends. May her soul find warmth, where ours yet endure cold. The small wooden coffin, handmade by Wulfric the Cooper, was lowered with ropes. It was light, too light. Ansel watched, hands clenched at his sides, a strange ache blooming in his chest. He had only spoken to Lena twice. Once, when she dropped a doll in the lane and he handed it back. Once, when they raced to the well. But he remembered her laugh, high and sudden, like a sparrow in flight. Now, that sound would never come again. As the coffin settled into the grave, Britha stepped forward. In her hands she held a simple bundle, a length of ribbon and a small carved wooden sheep. She loved this, she said, her voice hoarse. Her Da made it last winter. She placed the sheep gently atop the coffin, the ribbon fluttering slightly in the still air. Then the ropes were pulled away, and the earth returned, shovelful by shovelful. The thuds were slow and heavy, each one final. Edith held Ansel's hand, tightly, her fingers cold but steady. "Why do we do this?" he asked quietly. "To remember," she replied, "and to keep the cold from stealing more than it must." When the grave was filled, Father Elric placed a small wooden cross at its head. The villagers began to drift away in silence, their footsteps tracing solemn lines through the snow. Britha lingered a while longer, kneeling in the snow beside the mound. Edith approached slowly, kneeling beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Ollie, bring stew tonight," Edith said, "and bread, if we have any left." Britha nodded, eyes still fixed on the earth. Ansel stepped forward and placed a single pine cone on the grave. It was all he had, and then they turned and walked back through the snow, the chapel fading behind them like a ghost. Back home, Osric was awake, though weak. Edith knelt beside him, checked his fever. It was still high, but no worse. Ansel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "She was just a girl," he murmured. "She hadn't done anything wrong." Osric's voice rasped from the bed. "Winter doesn't care, lad. It comes for lambs and wolves alike." "But it's not fair." "No," Osric said, "it isn't. But in this world, we don't live by fairness. We live by fire and by the hands we hold when the dark comes close." That night, Edith made a thin stew with barley and carrot and brought a small pot to Britha's home. Britha said little, only thanked her and closed the door slowly. In the cottage, the fire burned strong again. Osric drifted in and out of sleep, his breath easier than the day before. Perhaps the worst was passing. Ansel lay awake for a long time, watching the shadows play across the beams. He thought of Lena, of the cold earth, of the ribbon fluttering like a silent goodbye. "Will there be more burials?" he asked suddenly. Edith looked toward him. "Yes, there always are in winters like this." He was quiet a moment longer, then, "But we're still here." "Yes," she said, "we are." And as the fire crackled low and the night returned in full, they curled close together beneath their patchwork blankets, small lights holding against the dark. Outside, the yew tree stood watch, its branches dusted in white, and beneath it, one more story had come to rest. By the 14th day of snow, Wythcombe's cottages had grown quieter. Not from peace, but from weariness. Hunger had begun its slow, familiar work. Shrinking bellies, dimming eyes, thinning hope. The villagers now spoke in hushed tones, saving their strength. Meals were measured by spoonfuls, and sleep became a way to forget the ache in one's stomach. Even the children, once given to games and laughter, had fallen still, curling in corners like kittens trying to stay warm. In the Osric cottage, the last of the flour was gone. "We can boil bones," Edith murmured, turning over the few scraps of root in her basket. "There's marrow still inside, barely. Osric, still weak but breathing better. sat wrapped in furs, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "The manor holds grain," he said quietly. Ansel, seated near the hearth, looked up. "The Lord's granary?" Edith frowned. "They don't give it freely." Osric's gaze met hers. "But they must. The tithe is meant for winters like this. When the people suffer, the grain must return." But the villagers knew well enough that what should be and what was often danced different steps. The manor that sat atop the eastern hill was the seat of Sir Alric de Havering, Lord of Withcombe and all its lands. His banners hung above carved gates. His crest, a stag beneath a winter moon, etched into the stone arch above his grain stores. Sir Alric had not visited the village in weeks. It was said he remained within his hall, feasting with his retainers, well stocked from harvests that had gone better on his own lands than in the peasant plots. Grain was kept under lock and key, guarded by armed stewards who did not answer to the hunger in the valley. Still, there were whispers, rumours that some families had begun to send quiet petitions. A loaf here, a ladle of barley there. None returned, empty-handed, but nor did they return without cost. "We should go," Edith said at last. "If only to ask." Ansel's eyes widened. "To the manor?" Edith nodded. "At first light. If they refuse us, at least we'll know." And so, as the sun struggled to rise behind clouds thick with snow, Edith wrapped herself in her best cloak, faded green wool, once fine, and took Ansel by the hand. They left Osric by the fire, with enough wood to last till nightfall. The road to the manor was treacherous. Snow had drifted high in places, and the path curved upward through narrow woods and frozen fields. It was the only road wide enough for wagons, though none had passed in weeks. Ansel trudged beside his mother, teeth chattering, cheeks red from wind. As they approached the manor gates, their breath caught. The manor itself was a stone giant, half shrouded in frost and ivy. Smoke billowed from its tall chimneys. The windows glowed faintly with candlelight. Around the gate, a wooden palisade bore the marks of repair, scars from years past, perhaps from storm or siege. 2 men stood guard. Both wore chainmail beneath, thick woolen coats, and carried spears capped with iron. They watched Edith and Ansel approach with narrowed eyes. "State your business," one called. "We seek audience with the steward," Edith said, voice even. The guard frowned. "The steward does not meet with villagers. We come on behalf of Withcombe." "There are children going hungry." A long silence followed. Then, reluctantly, the second guard vanished inside. Minutes passed. Ansel shifted beside his mother, nervous beneath the gaze of the first man. At last, the steward appeared. He was tall, gaunt, with a lined face and sharp eyes. His name was Master Elwyn, long known in Withcombe as a man of ledgers, not mercy. "You come seeking grain," he said without pleasantry. Edith nodded. "A small allotment, enough to stretch a few, more days." "The Lord has already granted several favours this season," Elwyn replied. "Each one depletes what must last till spring. The granary is not a bottomless well, and our hunger is not a passing wind," Edith said. The steward considered her. "Do you offer service in return?" Edith hesitated. "What sort of service?" "There are linens to be washed, floors to be scrubbed, and there is muck to be cleared from the lower pens." "Then I'll do it," she said, her chin rising. "But feed my son." Master Elwyn nodded curtly. "Wait here." He returned shortly with a small sack of barley and a crust of hard cheese. 3 days' worth, perhaps less. Return at first thaw for another share, if the stores permit. Edith bowed her head. "Thank you." Ansel clutched the sack tightly as they made their way back down the road. He looked up at his mother. "Why do they have so much, when we have so little?" "Because they were born to it," she replied. "And because we weren't." "It isn't right." "No, it isn't." When they returned home, Osric looked up from the hearth, and a smile broke his weathered face at the sight of food. That night, They shared the barley in a thick porridge, the cheese softened over fire and sliced thin. It was not a feast, but it filled them, and for the first time in days, they slept without the ache of emptiness gnawing at their dreams. Still, the manor stood above them, filled with light and warmth and plenty, while Whitcomb scraped through the cold, and winter, like a patient creditor, waited for its due. By the 17th day of snow, something else had begun to prowl the edges of Whitcomb. Not wolves, not bandits, but dogs, strays, starved. Gaunt and ghost-like, they roamed in ones and twos through the alleys and along the frozen hedgerows, their eyes yellow with desperation. Ansel first noticed one while fetching water from the well. A thin creature, rib bones like the ribs of a shipwreck, stood watching him from the lane. Its fur was patchy, ears torn, and it made no sound, only stared, breath pluming in the frost. He backed away slowly, heart pounding. The bucket sloshed. When he told Edith, she frowned deeply. "They're hungry," she said, "and when dogs are hungry enough, they forget they were ever tame." In normal seasons, village dogs were companions, guardians of flocks, scavengers of scraps. But in winters like this, when even families went without, there were no bones to throw, no crusts left under the table, and hunger, when deep enough, changes more than the body. It changes nature. By evening, the first chicken had vanished from Breatha's coop. She arrived at Edith's door, flushed and breathless. "Feathers all over the snow," she said. "No prints but paws. Big ones." Edith closed her eyes briefly. "We'll have to be careful. Lock the doors. Keep Ansel close." "We should speak to the Reeve," Breatha said. "Or Father Elric. We can't lose more." But Wulfric, who heard the tale while passing, only shook his head. "Reeve Morland's lad was bitten last year, trying to chase one off. You want to chase them. Do it in daylight, and with more than one." That night, the wind blew stronger, carrying with it sounds more unnerving than cold alone. Whines, growls, the dry snap of teeth over bone. Osric, lying beneath his blankets, stirred and whispered, "The dogs are not the first to starve." In his younger days, Osric had worked near London during a particularly bad winter. He remembered packs, once pets, now feral, roaming through alleyways, attacking children too weak to run. The starving have no loyalty, nor memory. That night, Edith double-barred the door and laid her knife beside her sleeping mat. Ansel slept, close, wrapped in furs, dreams unsettled. Just before dawn, a howl rose over the village. Not a wolf's call, deeper, closer, more human in its sorrow. Others answered it, then silence. When morning came, the Thornleys found their goat pen torn open. "She'd just given milk," Emmy said through gritted teeth, tears frozen to her cheeks. "There's nothing left but hoofprints, and hoofprints weren't the only thing." Blood stained the snow behind the barn, red, thick, still frozen in a splash. No one had heard the struggle. Father Elric called a meeting in the chapel. It was rare to gather in daylight, rarer still when so many had lost strength, but fear has a way of lending energy. They huddled in the cold pews, the fire in the chapel, too small to warm so many. "These are not the dogs we knew," the priest said. "They are winter's orphans now, wild and hungry. They come for what we love." Reeve Morland, standing nearby, added grimly, "We'll need to hunt them, track them, before more is lost." Edith stepped forward. "They're only here because we starve." Father Elric looked at her, eyes tired. "We can mourn their hunger, but we must protect our own." That afternoon, the men formed a small party. 6 in all, spears in hand, torches ready. Ansel begged to go, but Edith held him firm. "No. Stay. Watch the fire. Keep it alive." And so he did. The hunters left trails in the snow, weaving between cottages and toward the woods where the dogs had been seen slipping at dusk. Wulfric led them, his heavy axe slung over his shoulder. Morland carried a bow, though few arrows remained. The hunt lasted until nightfall. They returned with blood on their boots and 2 pelts. "We got them near the old mill," Morland said, voice grave. "One ran, one didn't. But there was no victory in their faces, no triumph, only fatigue, only the echo of claws in the snow. The pelts were dried and strung beside the chapel, their presence a warning, though none said it aloud. That night, Ansel asked, "Were they bad?" Osric, awake but pale, looked at him and shook his head slowly. "No, they were just hungry, like us." Ansel thought a long while. Then, "Will it be enough? The hunting? The grain?" Edith stirred the pot over the fire. "It has to be." And, in truth, that was what everyone in Whitcomb whispered to themselves at night. It has to be. It must. Somehow. But the snow had not ceased. The wind still curled under every doorframe. The woodpile was low again, and hunger, while driven back by fire and faith, was never far. Later that evening, Osric told a tale of an old village where winter lasted 3 years, and the people turned to carving warmth from stone. Ansel listened with wide eyes, unsure what it meant, but soothed by the sound of it. Outside, only the firelight moved, and in the distance, somewhere beyond the trees, a single howl rose, fainter now, as if the last of the pack still lingered, searching for what little remained. The barrel was empty. Edith held it upside down over a cracked wooden cup, and not a drop fell. The scent of yeast and old grain still lingered in the rim, taunting her with memories of warmth and fullness. But the last of the ale was gone. There would be no more, not here, not soon. In Whitcomb, ale was no luxury. It was a part of life, as common and essential as bread or firewood. Clean water was not always safe to drink, especially in the stagnant wells of winter. And ale, mild, nourishing and brewed with care, was often the only shield against illness and thirst. For many, it was food in a cup, warmth in the belly, and light in long, cold nights. Now, that comfort was slipping through their fingers like thawed snow. Osric watched from his place beside the hearth, his breath shallow but steady. "In my younger days," he rasped, "we'd have kept a spare cask behind the altar. The priest would serve it warm after evening prayers, said it kept the devil out of the bones." Edith smiled faintly. "Father Elric's bones must be holy by now. He's been dry since Epiphany." "We all are," Osric muttered. The truth weighed heavily on every home in Whitcomb. The last communal barrel, stored in the chapel cellar, had been tapped a week ago. The brewer's cottage, where hope might still lie, had been dark and silent for days. It was Ansel who spoke what all were thinking. "What if he still has some?" Edith looked up from her stitching. "Tom?" He nodded. "He never gives much, but he always keeps a barrel for himself." Edith considered. Old Tom the brewer had always been a strange soul, keeping mostly to himself in his crooked house on the north side of the village. But he was also proud of his work. He brewed with honey when he could find it, with juniper and dried apple when he couldn't. And it was said he never let his stores run dry, even when the frost bit deepest. She stood slowly, brushing off her skirt. "We'll go in the morning." The next day broke pale and still. The wind had quieted, and the snow lay untouched like a blank page. Edith and Ansel stepped out wrapped in wool, carrying a small bundle of dry wood and herbs as offering. The walk to the brewer's house was slow, each footfall swallowed by the deepening snow. When they reached the house, Edith paused. The shutters were closed. No smoke drifted from the chimney. She knocked once, then twice. No answer. She glanced at Ansel, then pushed gently. The door creaked open, spilling a cold draught into the yard. Inside, the house was dim. The smell of grain and old drink hung heavy in the air. Barrels lined the walls, some cracked, some sealed. In the far corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt, someone stirred. "Back already?" came a dry voice. Edith stepped closer. "Tom?" The old man sat up slowly, blinking. His beard was longer than she remembered, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. "Didn't think I'd see visitors," he murmured. "Not in weather like this. We came hoping you had a cask. For the village." He coughed, a deep, rattling sound, and waved a hand toward the back room. "One left, meant to save it for spring. But spring seems far away." Edith and Ansel moved carefully. The cask was small but sturdy, a good half full by her guess, enough to warm hearts for at least one more gathering. "You'll come too?" she asked. Tom leaned back. "If I can stand." That evening, for the first time in weeks, the chapel doors opened wide after dusk. Villagers came slowly, one by one, drawn by rumor and hope. Children peered through cracked windows. Old men shuffled forward with walking sticks and frost-stung fingers. Even Reeve Morlan arrived, looking less a magistrate than a man simply, hungry for cheer. Inside the fire blazed high. The smell of warm ale, spiced with cloves and dried herbs, filled the air. Edith ladled it gently, handing mugs to waiting hands. No one drank deeply, but each sip loosened something inside. A tightness, a fear, a silent sorrow. The warmth was more than physical. Osric, seated near the flames, took his cup with shaking hands. "Now that," he sighed, "is what life tastes like." Wulfric the cooper leaned in with a rare grin. Tom's finest batch yet. The old brewer, now resting on a bench near the altar, gave a sleepy chuckle. It was never meant to last this long, but neither was winter. Then, something unexpected happened. A voice rose. Not loud at first, but strong and familiar. It was Emmy Thornley, her voice soft as moss, carrying the first notes of an old folk song. Others joined, hesitantly at first, then stronger, verse by verse, voices twined together like smoke. It was a song of the sea, though none in Withcombe had seen the ocean in years. A song of boats and homecoming and the warmth of spring sun. Even Father Elric, long reserved, hummed along, and in that moment, it no longer mattered that their bellies were half empty, that the woodpile was low, or that the snow lay deep and unyielding. They were together. They remembered who they were before the cold, and they sang. Ansel sat by the fire, head against Edith's shoulder, mug clutched in his mittens. "Will we make it?" he whispered. "We will," she replied, "one night at a time." And as the final notes faded and the mugs were drained and the last of the cask emptied, the people of Withcombe stepped out into the moonlight with lighter hearts. The snow still lay thick, but the silence had been broken. Even beneath all the snow, the fields remembered. Though no green sprouted and no furrows lay open, the land itself was not dead, only sleeping. Yet in Withcombe, that sleep grew longer with each passing day of cold. By the fourth week of snow, the earth beneath the white crust had hardened like stone, and the farmer's eyes turned anxiously to the sky, watching for signs that the world might, at last, begin to wake. Osric sat wrapped in furs by the hearth, staring out the small window where frost had painted delicate feathers on the glass. "You'd never guess," he said softly, "that there are seeds lying just beneath that white." Ansel looked up from the fire. "Seeds? Even now?" "Oh, yes," Osric said, nodding. "We always plant a few just before the frost takes hold. The winter wheat, it's called. It sleeps through the cold, waiting. It's braver than we are." "But how does it know when to wake up?" Osric chuckled. "Same way we do, lad. The light tells it." But that light still seemed so far away. In a world ruled by the wheel of the year, midwinter was both a time of silence and a time of secrets. Fields that once bustled with carts and labourers now lay untouched beneath feet of snow, and the tools of the harvest leaned unused against barn walls. Still, hope stirred underground, unseen. It was this hope that drew the villagers out that day, not for planting, no, not yet, but for checking, for remembering, for the old tradition of walking the fields in midwinter, placing hand to soil, speaking the names of seeds sown in faith. Edith bundled Ansel tightly, wrapping his scarf twice around his neck. "Come," she said. "We'll go to the barley plot. It's time." Outside, the air was sharp and biting, but the sky had lightened to a pale silver, and for the first time in weeks, the wind had softened to a whisper. Snow still blanketed everything, but the edges had begun to crumble, and the icicles on the eaves dripped with the slow rhythm of approaching thaw. They passed Breatha along the path, already heading toward her family's cabbage beds. She carried a wooden spoon in her hand. "For knocking on the earth," she explained. "Just a tap, like a prayer." At the field, the snow lay deep, but Edith knew the rose well. She brushed it aside gently with her gloves until she reached the crusted soil. It was hard, cold, still. "Here," she whispered, and Ansel knelt beside her. "What do we do?" "We touch it," she said, "and we remember what we planted, so it knows we haven't forgotten." He placed his small palm against the frozen dirt. It felt like stone, but he imagined it breathing underneath, slow, quiet, steady. "We planted barley," Edith murmured, "and we planted hope." The ritual was old. No one remembered when it had begun, but each family did it. Some brought tools, others flowers made of straw. A few, like Breatha, sang softly, a lullaby for the land. Down the slope, Reeve Morland stood alone at the edge of the grain fields. Even he, so often stern, bowed his head. "We won't till for weeks yet," Edith said as they stood again. "But it helps, just to come, just to say we're still waiting." Ansel looked around at the scattered figures across the snowy fields. They stood like statues, scattered across the land, each one a keeper of some promise. "Do the seeds hear?" "Us? I don't know," Edith replied. "But I think the earth does." They returned slowly, past stone walls half buried in snow and branches slick with ice. In the distance, the river was still frozen solid, its surface dull beneath the sky. But even the birds had begun to return. The crows were louder that morning, and a robin had been seen near the church steps. That afternoon, Osric asked where they had gone, and when Ansel told him, the old man smiled. "We used to leave bits of bread," he said. "Offerings, foolish perhaps, but we thought the land liked to be fed." Edith stirred the pot on the hearth. "I don't think it's foolish. Everything needs reminding it's loved." That evening, they shared a thinner meal, dried nettle soup and a small piece of bread saved from the chapel gathering. The warmth from the night of songs had faded, but the memory of it still clung like ember smoke. "Do you remember the year the wheat didn't wake?" Osric asked suddenly. Edith nodded. "I was 12. Too much frost," he said. "Too deep. The snow melted, but the seeds were lost. Never came up. What happened?" He sighed. "We rationed. Some traded with the next village. Some didn't last. That's why we remember the fields now, in case the seeds need reminding." That night, Ansel dreamed of fields full of golden stalks, swaying gently under a warm sky. He dreamed of oxen pulling wooden plows and of people laughing beneath wide hats, their baskets overflowing. He dreamed of the sound of scythes through grain, and in his dream, the earth hummed softly, slow and deep, like the breath of something vast and living. When he woke, the snow was falling again, but lighter this time, softer, and outside the window, something strange, the sound of a drip, drip, drip from the roof melt. It was not the end, but it was a sign, and beneath the snow, the seeds waited still, patient, sleeping, listening. The church bell did not ring that Sunday. It hung still and silent in the tower above the chapel, a grey shadow behind frosted panes. In a village where time was marked by its voice, by its toll at dawn, its call to prayer, its knell for the dead, its silence was deafening. Edith noticed first. She had risen early, as she always did, to stoke the fire and stir the embers into life. She paused, waiting for the familiar sound to ripple through the snow-covered air. But nothing came, only wind. only the groan of the rafters under their frost-heavy weight. Ansel stirred beside Osric's bed. "Is it morning yet?" "It is," Edith replied, "but the bell is sleeping." At midday, the chapel doors opened nonetheless. The villagers, wrapped in wool and silence, made their way slowly to the service. Without the bell's call, they came later, unsure of the time, guided only by instinct and routine. The pews filled more slowly. The hymns, when they came, were softer. Father Elric stood at the altar, pale and tired. He raised his hands to bless the gathered, but even he seemed aware of the silence above him. The chapel was cold, colder than usual, and every breath hung like incense between the rafters. After the service, Wulfric the Cooper approached the priest. "She didn't ring," he said quietly. "I know," Father Elric replied. "The rope is frozen stiff, and the bell itself is iced over. I tried this morning. It won't budge. It's never missed a Sunday." "No," the priest said. "It hasn't." The bell had hung in Withcombe's chapel tower for nearly 2 centuries. Forged by the hands of monks in a warmer, wealthier age, its voice had marked births and deaths, feasts and fasts. It had told for soldiers marching to war and for ploughmen laying down their tools. It had never gone silent. That afternoon, villagers gathered outside the chapel to stare up at the tower. The icicles hung from the eaves like glass knives. Snow had gathered in the crevices of the stonework. The bell's clapper, just visible through the slats, was wrapped in frost. Edith and Ansel stood beside Father Elric. "What happens if it never rings again?" the boy asked. The priest looked down at him with kind eyes. "Then we must listen for something else." That night, the silence lingered. There was no bell to mark the evening hour, no chime to begin the nightly prayers. Only the snap of the fire and the soft rustle of blankets. Osric shifted in his bed. "That bell's older than any of us," he said. "You can feel it in your bones when it rings, like it knows the truth better than we do." Edith nodded. "And now it's frozen." Osric smiled weakly. "Like everything else." But the next morning, something unexpected happened. Tom the brewer arrived at the chapel steps with a bundle of kindling and a strange glint in his eye. Behind him came Merowyn the shepherd boy, carrying an old iron brazier. Wulfric followed, pulling a cart of straw and pitch-soaked branches. "We'll thaw her out," Tom said simply. "You're what?" Father Elric asked, startled. "We'll climb the tower," Wulfric added. "Warm the air around her, light a brazier below the bell. She won't stay quiet forever." The villagers watched with wide eyes as the men set to work. They dragged the brazier up the narrow stairwell of the chapel tower, step by icy step, until they reached the bell platform. There, in the open cold, beneath centuries of carved stone, they laid the fire. It was not easy. The wind howled through the slats. The iron of the bell groaned like something alive. But slowly, patiently, the heat began to build. Ansel stood outside with the others, staring up at the tower's crown. Smoke curled from the slit windows like the breath of a waking beast. And then, a sound. Drip. Then another. Water fell from the lip of the bell, trickling down its side, falling like tears onto the stones below. And then, when the sun broke briefly through the clouds, the bell gave a single, low creak. The rope, once stiff with frost, slackened. Father Elric took the cord with trembling hands. He pulled, and the bell rang, not loudly, not the full roar it was known for, but it spoke. A low, uncertain toll that echoed across the snowy fields, a sound like a memory returning after a long journey. The villagers gasped, then they cheered. Ansel whooped and clapped his mittens, laughing despite himself. Even Osric, listening from the cottage, smiled through his cracked lips. "She woke," he whispered. From that day on, the bell did not miss another morning. Her voice remained softer through the rest of the winter, as if the cold had aged her. But she spoke, and the people listened. "She's like us," Breatha said one afternoon. "Weathered, weary, but still here." The bell became more than a timekeeper. It was a sign that the frost could be endured, that silence was not forever, that even metal struck still by ice could ring again. Edith said as much to Father Elric one evening, and he only smiled. "She never really left us," he said. "She only needed help remembering who she was." And so it was, in Withcom's longest winter, that a frozen bell reminded the people how to wait, how to endure, how to hope, even in the silence. Outside, the snow still fell, but now it fell to a rhythm, and from the chapel tower, a bell answered back. By the 5th week of snow, the walls began to feel closer. It was not the cold alone that crept into the bones of Withcom's people, but the weight of long confinement. Cottages, built small to preserve warmth, became cramped prisons. Rooms, once cozy, turned airless. Voices grew sharper. Silences stretched longer, and for many, it was not the chill without that wore them down, but the cold within. Inside the cottage, Edith turned the same pot of stew for the 3rd day in a row. She stirred it quietly, watching how the broth clung thinly to the sides. No meat remained, only herbs, dried cabbage, and bits of hard bread. She added snow, letting it melt slowly to stretch the liquid. Osric dozed near the hearth, his breathing steadier now, though still shallow. The worst of the fever had passed, but left him weakened, quieter. Ansel, curled in the corner with his slate board, was restless. He scratched symbols into the soot-dusted surface and erased them again. Again. "Can we go out?" he asked without looking up. Edith shook her head. "Not today. The wind's too sharp. We could go to Breatha's. She's tending her niece. The little one's taken a cough." Ansel exhaled through his nose, rubbing the board clean again. "It's always the same. Every day." "It won't be forever," Edith said, her voice soft, but it lacked conviction. In winter, time twisted. Days blended. The fire became a friend and a tyrant. It demanded constant tending, but gave little back. The walls that once kept out the cold now held in the fatigue. Tension brewed in quiet glances, in murmured reproaches over how quickly the woodpile shrank, or how the water bucket was filled too little. There was no room for arguments to escape, no doors to close behind a slammed exit. The village's people were locked in with their kin, their hunger, and their fraying patience. Outside, the snow continued to fall, light but constant. The sky was the colour of old wool, thick and low. By late afternoon, the wind shifted. It came from the east, sharp and bitter. The shutters rattled in their frames. Edith pulled her shawl tighter, her shoulders stiff. She longed to breathe air that hadn't passed through the same 4 walls. At sunset, she ventured out to fetch water and found Breatha already at the well. Her face was drawn. "Your niece?" Edith asked, still breathing. But her cheeks are grey. They worked in silence for a while, drawing buckets, their gloved hands chafing rope. "Do you feel it too?" Breatha asked finally. Edith looked up. "Feel what?" "This heaviness, like the walls press in." Edith nodded. "We're too many days closed up, and too little light." Breatha's eyes narrowed toward the chapel, now only faintly visible in the falling dusk. "My brother left his wife once, one winter, long ago. Said he needed air. Walked to the woods and didn't come back." Edith frowned. "Why?" "He couldn't bear it. Said it wasn't the hunger, it was the closeness, the breath of others." Edith didn't answer. She only looked toward her own home, where the fire still flickered through the window, and her son waited with questions she could not answer. That night, she lit a second candle, not for light, but for space. The flickering twin flames seemed to part the darkness just a little more. "Tell us a story," Ansel said, his voice softer now. Osric stirred. "What sort?" "Something Far away, Ansel said. Not here, not snow. Osric chuckled faintly. Very well, he cleared his throat. There once was a city made of glass, he began. Far to the south where the sun never died. The walls of its houses shimmered, and when you spoke, the words echoed forever. The people there did not hide from winter because they did not know it. But one year, a shadow crept over the sea. As he spun the tale, the room felt larger, not in size, but in spirit. The story widened it, gave breath to the narrow corners. Edith leaned back, her eyes closing. Brytha, invited in with a cup of thin broth, listened quietly, hands wrapped around the warm clay. When the tale ended, Ansel smiled. Do you think the glass city still exists? Perhaps, Osric said. Perhaps it's waiting for us. Sleep came easier that night, and with it, dreams not of snow and silence, but of sunlight on shimmering walls. But not all homes in Withcombe found such peace. Down the lane, in the cottage of the tailor's widow, voices rose in anger. Her son, barely 16, had tried to steal dried meat from a neighbour's store. The boy was caught, weeping and ashamed, but the damage was done. Trust wore thin in winter. Father Elric mediated, speaking of forgiveness and the strain of scarcity. But forgiveness, though preached, was harder to live. Another cottage held a man who hadn't spoken in 3 days. His wife said he only sat, by the fire, staring at the walls. She feared he might not speak again. It was not illness that frayed the village now, but confinement. The walls held out the snow, but also held in sorrow, boredom, and the slow erosion of cheer. Edith noticed Ansel talking to himself more, muttering stories under his breath. She didn't stop him. We all need someone to talk to, she said, brushing a hand over his hair. The village was not breaking, but it was cracking. Tiny, hairline fissures in the spirit. And everyone knew, if the thaw did not come soon, those cracks might widen. But still, the fire was lit. Still the bell tolled. And still beneath the weight of walls and winter, the people of Withcombe waited. The river was silent now. Where once it gurgled and whispered its way through Withcombe's valley, it now lay frozen under a smooth, glassy shell. White in some places, blue in others, and black where the ice was thin enough to reveal the depths below. It had been this way for weeks. The children had stopped playing on it after a goat from the Thornley farm broke through near the bend and was never seen again. Since then, even the bravest among them gave the banks a wide berth, and no one fetched water from that source now. Yet still, the river was watched. It was feared in the cold and feared more at the thaw. Edith stood on its bank that morning, her boots crunching softly over frozen reeds. The air was sharp, but not bitter. A change, subtle, but present. The icicles dripping from the low branches now fell by midday. The sky no longer carried the full weight of grey. Osric had been the one to suggest it. Go see her, he'd said, voice raspy. The river always tells the truth before the fields do. So she had walked, alone, wrapped in every layer she could spare, her breath fogging as she moved. She stopped a few feet from the ice's edge, where a large log jutted out, blackened, and stripped of bark. Beneath the surface, stillness, but not sleep. A crack ran diagonally across the far side, like a frozen lightning bolt. It had not been there 3 days ago, and the air carried a scent. Damp, clean, familiar. The first breath of moving water. Edith knelt and placed a hand on the surface. It was bitter cold, but something beneath shifted. Faint, faint as a heartbeat. When she returned, Ansel was feeding sticks into the hearth, and Osric was dozing. It's beginning, she said softly. Ansel looked up. The thaw? Soon, he smiled. Will the river sing again? Yes, Edith said, but not kindly. For while the frozen river was dangerous in its silence, the thaw brought different perils. Ice cracked without warning. Water surged, beneath slush. The banks flooded. In years past, entire footpaths had been swept away. One year, a cottage near the mill had been pulled from its moorings. And always, the thaw came before the earth was ready. Father Elric, in his sermons, spoke of the river as a test. The cold binds it, but it remembers how to move. It waits with patience, and when it moves again, it reminds us, nothing stays still forever. That week, the villagers began preparing. Breatha stuffed gaps in her walls with bundles of straw and rags soaked in wax to keep the moisture out. Wulfric inspected the wooden bridge that crossed the narrowest part of the river near the chapel, testing its beams with hammer and eye. The reeve asked the blacksmith to mend the hooks and chains used to drag firewood and carts to safety in case the river rose. At night, people listened not just for wolves or wind, but for the sound of breaking ice. On the 6th night of that week, it came. It began with a low groan, then a crack, a sharp, clean sound, like a whip. Then, silence. Edith sat up in bed. So did Osric. It started, he said. In the morning, the river was changed. The ice no longer lay smooth. Jagged fissures sliced through it like claw marks. Water pulsed beneath in irregular surges. On the south bend, a long ridge of ice had split open and sunk, forming a ridge of frozen shards. Children stared from a distance. Adults warned them back. The ice is hungry now, Breatha warned. That same day, the Thornleys lost a fence post. The current had risen overnight, and what had seemed stable ground was now mud and rushing water. Their youngest pig, terrified, slipped on the bank and vanished beneath the edge. Ansel asked, "Will the whole village flood?" "No," Edith said. "Not the high places, but we must be careful." Father Elric called for a procession. "We will walk the river path," he declared, "and remind it we are watching." It was not a command, nor truly a blessing, but something older, a tradition forgotten in many places. A symbolic walk along the river's edge, bearing candles, singing hymns, laying dried herbs and branches on the banks to appease the spirit of the flood. And so they walked. On the 7th day, as clouds thinned and the wind grew wet and whispering, the people of Wethcombe moved in slow procession down the river's edge. Edith carried a bundle of rosemary. Ansel carried a candle, shielded by his hands. Osric did not walk, but he stood in the cottage window, watching. The river moaned beneath them, its ice fracturing in slow, inevitable lines. The water was coming. Father Elric spoke prayers, old ones, half in Latin, half in some older tongue. Few understood the words, but the tone was known, a plea for balance, a plea for mercy. They cast herbs upon the water, laid branches in cradles by the bank, and then, in a voice not loud but steady, Breitha began to sing, a song of the river, of its gifts and its grief. Others joined, and the thaw continued. That night, Edith sat beside the fire, brushing melted snow from her boots. Ansel stared at the flickering coals. "Is the river angry?" he asked. "No," she said, "just waking." "Is that worse?" "Sometimes," she admitted. Osric stirred. "It means the earth is changing. It means spring is coming, and spring comes with danger, but also with hope." "Will there be flowers?" "Not yet," Edith said. "But soon," Osric added. "And after flowers, food. And after food, a feast." Ansel smiled. "Will we dance?" "We will," Edith said, pulling him close. "We will dance on green grass and wear garlands and eat until we are full." But outside, the river still, cracked and shifted, reshaping the land as it awoke, and Wythcombe watched, tired, wary, but ready. There came a day when the woodpile vanished. Not suddenly, not with drama, but slowly, stick by stick, until one morning Edith stepped outside to find only snow where the logs had been. The pile that once stood like a miniature fortress beside. The cottage wall had been consumed, its every piece turned to ember and ash. She stood there in the weak sunlight, staring at the emptiness. Only one log remained, inside, beside the hearth. It was thick and dry, cut from the ash tree Osric had felled the previous summer. They had saved it, not for its size, but for its burn, steady, hot, slow. It was the log of last resort, the one meant for a storm or a night of desperate cold. Now, it was the only thing left between them and the bitter wind. Edith returned inside, brushing the snow from her skirt. The fire crackled low in the hearth, kept alive with twigs and thatch. Osric dozed in his chair, his breath misting faintly in the air. Ansel sat with his knees drawn to his chest, wrapped in the patchwork shawl Edith had made when he was born. She laid a hand on the last log. Ansel watched her. "Are we going to burn it?" "Not yet," she replied. Osric stirred. "We'll need to before night. It'll drop cold again." Edith said nothing. She turned the log in her hands, feeling its weight. It wasn't just wood. It was memory. A symbol of how far they'd come, how close the end of winter now stood, and how cruel it was to still be choosing between fire and food, because burning the log meant no hot water, no boiled roots, no warmth to cook with. But not burning. It meant frost on the inside of the walls, breath so thick it felt like cloth, sleep disturbed by shivering, and dreams turned strange with cold. That day, Edith visited Breatha to ask if any spare wood remained. Breatha shook her head. "Gone. I burned the stools yesterday. We sit on crates now. What about Wulfric?" "He burned his fence, the one facing the pasture. The reeve bartered with the blacksmith, gave away his boots for 2 pine logs." Edith swallowed. "And the chapel?" Breatha's lips thinned. "Father, Elric says God will keep us warm." Edith knew what that meant. The chapel had no wood left either. The last log waited. At dusk, Edith returned home and found Osric awake, more alert than he'd been in days. "I've been thinking," he said. "Let the fire go cold tonight." She looked at him in surprise. "We bundle tight," he added. "Sleep close. Keep the log for tomorrow. We can boil the roots then. And if it's colder tomorrow? Then we'll wish we'd used it. Tonight. But we might be glad we didn't." She understood. It wasn't just a gamble with the weather. It was a decision about tomorrow. Every act of survival in winter was a bet placed in the dark. Ansel sat quietly by the hearth. "Can we tell a story, even if there's no fire?" Osric smiled. "Aye, stories don't need wood, just breath." That night, for the first time, since early autumn, the fire died before the moon rose. They covered the hearth with ashes, sealing in the last glow. They huddled together on the floor, Edith, Ansel, Osric, and wrapped themselves in every layer they owned. The cold seeped into their clothes, their skin, their bones. But Osric began a tale, voice low and warm. "There was once a boy who lived in a cave of ice," he said, "and inside that cave was a single spark, hidden deep in stone. Every night, he whispered stories to the spark, and every morning it grew brighter." Ansel listened with wide eyes. The wind howled around the cottage. The shutters groaned, but inside, a fire of another kind flickered. Osric's tale wove through the night, keeping them company as their limbs stiffened and breath turned white. He told of the boy who searched the mountains for a forgotten son, of wolves made of snow and a lake that sang, of how the spark finally became a flame when the boy spoke the story of his own heart. They slept at last, not warm, but not broken. In the morning, Edith lit the last log. She did it with ceremony, slowly, gently, laying twigs and dried moss beneath it, coaxing the flame like a newborn. When it caught, the glow filled the room like dawn. Steam rose from the pot. Osric nodded. Good choice. They drank hot water steeped with dried mint. Ansel dipped bread into the warmth and smiled for the first time in days. Outside, the snow had softened, Water dripped from the eaves. A robin fluttered past the window. Later that day, Breatha appeared with a surprise. A bundle of branches, small and knotted, but dry. "Fell behind the barn," she said. "Been buried under a drift." Edith wept when she saw it, not for the wood, but for the kindness. They fed it to the hearth that evening. The flames danced higher, and that night, the warmth was real, temporary, fragile, but real. And in Withcombe, that was enough. It happened in the dark, as many things do in the coldest part of winter. A door left open, not by carelessness, but by hunger. The Thornleys had stored their last dried meats in a locked chest beneath their floorboards. Salted venison, smoked rabbit, and a handful of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. It was meant to last until Candlemas, carefully rationed with broth and barley. But when Emmy Thornley woke in the early morning, the chest was open, and the food was gone. There was no sign of a broken latch, no footprints in the snow, only the cold wind drifting through a crack in the door and the silence of a house still asleep. Emmy wept silently as she stared into the empty chest. She did not call out, not right away. Instead, she sat for a long time, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, and stared at the empty hearth. Her youngest child stirred in sleep, none the wiser. By midday, the village knew. In Withcombe, theft was rare, especially in winter. There was an unspoken rule among the villagers. We do not steal in the cold, not because they were saints, but because to steal in winter was to kill. You didn't just take food, you took fire, breath, survival. It was Reeve Morland who came, to the Thornleys' door, flanked by Wulfric and Father Elric. Emmy met them with hollow eyes. "They didn't break in," she said quietly. "The door wasn't latched. It must have been someone who knew," Wulfric muttered. Father Elric said nothing, only placed a hand gently on Emma's arm. "May I look?" he asked. She led him to the chest. He knelt, examined the boards, ran his fingers along the edge where the lid met the frame. Then he stood again and shook his head. "Too clean, too careful." Reeve Morland straightened. "We'll speak to the village. Someone saw something." But no one had, or if they had, they said nothing. That evening, Father Elric called a gathering, in the chapel. Not for judgment, but for remembrance. He lit a single candle on the altar. "We speak often of mercy," he said, "but mercy is not forgiveness alone. It is prevention. It is action." He paused, letting the words settle. "The one who took from the Thornleys, if you are here, know that we understand fear. Know that we understand desperation. But you must also understand. You have endangered not only yourself, but a child." Silence. Frost gathered at the corners of the window. The candle flickered. "If what you took was needed, speak. If you made a mistake, speak. There is still room for mercy." Still, no one answered. But that night, something strange happened. Breatha heard it first, a soft knock at her door just before dawn. When she opened it, no one stood there. But on the step, wrapped in cloth, were 3 small bundles, a portion of salted meat, a sliver of cheese, and half a loaf of black bread. It wasn't all that had been taken, but it was part. She brought the bundle to Emmy at once. "I found this, outside my door," she said. "They're trying to make it right." Emmy took it wordlessly. Then after a long moment, she said, "Then I won't press the matter." Reeve Morland was informed. So was Father Elric. And though no name was spoken, a quiet agreement spread across the village. The debt had been acknowledged. No hunt, no punishment. But the wind carried something colder in its breath that week. Trust, once frayed, is never easily rewoven. Edith spoke little of the theft when Ansel asked, but she answered honestly. Sometimes hunger makes people forget who they are. "Is that what happened?" "Perhaps," she said. Or perhaps they remembered who they were and chose to try again. Ansel was quiet. Then, "Would you have forgiven them?" "I think I already have." That week, the snow melted in patches along the southern walls. Water pooled in corners. The river throbbed beneath its thinning skin. And with each drip, with each return of light, came the slow, aching thaw, not only of earth, but of hearts. The villagers began to speak more kindly again. Breatha shared roots with Merowyn's family. Wulfric repaired the chapel steps. Tom, the brewer, offered the last of his honey to sweeten what little ale remained. Edith gave Emma a strip of cloth from her own stores. "For the little one," she said, "for warmth." And though the nights were still cold, the fire burned higher now, not from abundance, but from effort shared. They were still afraid, still hungry, but less alone. Osric, watching from his chair, murmured one evening, "The hardest part of winter isn't surviving. It's staying human while you do." Edith looked at him. "Have we managed?" He smiled faintly. "So far." And that night she lit the fire early, letting the warmth fill the corners of the room. Ansel fell asleep beside it, a storybook in. His hands, its corners worn from reading and rereading. Outside, another door creaked open in the wind, but this time it let in warmth. Not theft, but the breath of spring approaching. When the thaw finally came, it did not arrive gently. It came with suddenness, like a door flung open to a long-absent guest. The cold did not vanish, but softened just enough to let water through. The kind of thaw that breaks things, not with violence, but with quiet insistence. The first to yield was the snow. It shrank from the eaves and roof lines, slipped from branches in heavy clumps, and disappeared from window ledges. What remained behind was not green or dry, but brown and soft, a wetness that pulled at the boots, that seeped into stone and bone alike. In Withcombe, the roads were no longer firm. They had become rivers of mud, deep, sucking, and cold. Carts could no longer roll. Hooves stuck. Steps slowed. A world once locked in white stillness now moved sluggishly, groaning with each shift. Edith stepped out that morning and felt the earth give beneath her. "Careful," Osric warned from inside. This is when the ground bites." He was right. The freeze had held the land in place, like glass over a painting. But now the edges warped, fences leaned, doorways sagged. Even the stone wall near the church had cracked straight through the middle, water oozing from between the split. The old road to the river bent like a spine with no strength, and the cottages that sat lower in the village began to weep. Mud and meltwater seeping through foundations, pooling in cellars, soaking straw. Britha's home was among the first affected. She stood ankle-deep in muck, sweeping it out with a broken broom, her face pale with exhaustion. "It came through the back," she said. "The whole hill's bleeding." Edith brought dry cloth and a handful of lavender for the stink. "We'll help patch the rear wall," she said. The Reeve came by later with Wulfric, both bearing shovels. Together, with Merowyn and a few others, they braced the cottage with beams salvaged from the old mill's stable. "We've seen worse," Morlan muttered, though his tone was grim. "But it always costs more in spring." It wasn't just homes. The bridge by the chapel, the one Wulfric had tested, collapsed. Late that afternoon, it didn't fall with drama, but with a series of groans and snaps as one end sank into the mud and pulled the planks with it. Father Elric stood nearby, watching the wreckage slump into the stream. "I suppose we walk the long way now," he said, almost gently. The thaw was not a promise. It was a test. The snow gave way to weight, and that weight broke what had been held up by frost alone. That evening, Edith's own door stuck in its frame. The wooden floor near the hearth began to bow. She stepped across it carefully, pressing with her foot. "We'll have to lift the boards," she told Osric. He nodded. "And pray there's no rot." But it wasn't only the earth that shifted. Hearts, too, changed. The villagers, long confined in silence, now found themselves face to face in the streets again. Though the streets were rivers, and the meetings brief, but it mattered. The thaw brought voices back, laughter here and there, complaints mostly, but shared, and shared suffering lightened its own load. Ansel helped clear paths near the chapel, dragging stones and branches aside with Brytha's nephew. They returned filthy, wet to the knees, but grinning. "We made a new stream," Ansel declared. "You unblocked the old ditch," Edith corrected. "Still counts." Osric chuckled from his chair. But the thaw also brought illness. The cold kept bodies still. Dampness stirred them again, woke what lay hidden in lungs, in joints, in old wounds. Coughs returned, limps reappeared. Fevers, like ghosts, crept back into beds where they had once been banished. Father Elric took to walking with a staff. Brytha's sister fell ill again. Even Tom the brewer, who had seemed so solid, now slept more than he stood. But no one complained. Not truly. They were too busy trying to keep the water out. On the fourth day of thaw, a small landslide blocked the path to the outer fields. It carried with it a stone wall, half a fence, and 3 trees. The road was gone. Ansel stared at the wreckage. "Will we rebuild it?" "Of course," Edith said. "We always do. But it's so much." She knelt beside him. "Every spring feels like this. Heavy, wet, endless. But soon there will be green. Even here, especially here." She pointed to the base of the broken wall, where beneath all the mud, a single shoot of green had appeared. A nettle, sharp, stubborn, alive. That night the fire burned low again, but not from lack. They had wood now, damp but passable. Instead, they burned less by choice, conserving for rebuilding. Osric told a tale, not of snow this time, but of rain, of a land that flooded for 40 days and nights until the people lived in trees and boats. And when they came down again, he said, they had forgotten what dry feet felt like. Ansel laughed. "Is that what's coming next?" he asked. "Maybe," Osric said. "Or maybe flowers." Edith smiled faintly, and outside, beneath the soft breath of warming air, the fields of Withcombe stirred beneath their cloak of mud and thaw. They were broken, but not beaten. The green came slowly. Not in waves or banners, but in whispers. Soft hints of colour brushing the edges of fields and paths like forgotten memories being rewritten. It began with the nettles, as Edith had seen. Then tufts of wild garlic in the lee of the chapel wall, tiny sprigs of sorrel by the stream. The moss on the stones deepened from grey to velvet green, and the brown sludge of thawed earth dried in sunlit patches that steamed under morning light, and with it came the birds. Crows and sparrows first, then the cheerful chatter of wrens. By the 3rd week of thaw, a blackbird nested in the thorn bush near Edith's window, singing before the sun had fully risen. Its song was not lovely, rasping, raw, but it was full of life. Ansel was the first to notice the buds. He burst through the cottage door, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "There on the tree, the one by the well." Edith followed him, stepping carefully over the soft earth. And there, high on a single branch, were 4 tight buds, red-tipped, sealed like secrets, but real. She touched one gently. "Crabapple," she whispered. Osric nodded from the doorway, wrapped in his old cloak. Earliest bloomers those, always the brave ones. It was the first time he'd stood outside since January. The villagers began to gather again, not only in the chapel, but in the fields. There was work to be done, ground to be turned, fences to be lifted, paths to be mended. They moved slowly, their muscles stiff from months indoors, but there was a lightness in the way they spoke, in the way their boots sank into mud rather than snow. Father Elric called it the season of second breath. We have come through darkness, he said during the next gathering, but not unchanged. It was true. Faces were leaner, eyes more watchful, and the empty places in the chapel pews reminded them of who had not returned. Still, hands met hands in work and in prayer. Tom the brewer, though pale, began mixing his first batch again, using dried juniper and a touch of honey he'd saved for spring. Wulfric sharpened tools for planting. Breatha organized the gathering of herbs. Edith bartered with a distant cousin in the next village for new linen to repair their sleeping rolls. One morning, Ansel brought her a flower. "Where did you find this?" "Near the sheep field. It's small, but..." It was a primrose, faint yellow, soft as breath, the first wild bloom of the year. She placed it in a wooden bowl by the hearth. That evening, it glowed in the candlelight like a sun reborn. Osric, gazing at it, said, "They say when the first flower comes, you must thank it aloud, or it won't tell the others." And so Edith whispered, "Thank you." The next day, she found 2 more by the river path. But spring was not all gentleness. Alongside green came the aches. Backs bent from digging, blisters from tools long unused. Children fell in muddy ditches and returned covered in scrapes. The river, though no longer raging, still claimed the odd boot or stick, and the earth revealed what it had hidden. The bones of a lamb that hadn't survived, the broken tools left behind in panic, the fallen nest of an owl. Rebuilding always meant remembering. But the people faced it with grit. They mended walls with smiles, knowing each repaired board was a promise. They sowed seeds not with certainty, but with faith born of survival. Each furrow, each handful of barley dropped into the ground, was a prayer not spoken, but lived. One evening, as they rested after a day in the fields, Ansel asked, "Will we forget the winter?" Edith considered. "No," she said, "but it won't always feel so close." Osric added, "Some things are meant to be remembered, so we don't fall asleep next time." "What do you mean?" He looked at the fading fire. "It's easy, when things grow again, to believe they always will. But winter teaches us not to take the warm for granted, or the kind." Ansel was quiet a while. Then he said, "I think I'll remember the snow, but also the stories, and the L night, and the bell." "And that's enough," Edith said. Later that week, a festival was planned. Not grand, not full of riches, but meaningful. They called it the first fire, and each family brought a small piece of wood, dried and ready. Together they built a fire in the square, near the chapel, and lit it as the sun went down. Children danced, old songs were sung, bread was passed around, dry, simple, but fresh. Father Elric blessed the earth. Edith brought the primrose, now pressed between parchment, and placed it at the foot of the flame. Osric stood beside her, leaning on Ansel's shoulder. "You made it," he whispered. "We did," she replied. And as the stars blinked overhead and the fire crackled high into the soft spring air, the village of Withcombe remembered not only how winter had broken them, but how they had held each other through it. Tomorrow would bring new trials, but tonight they were together, alive, warm, and at last, in bloom. With the first warmth of true spring came the reckoning. It was a quiet tradition in Withcombe, never spoken of during winter, never rushed, but always awaited. When the snow was gone, when the river flowed steady and soft, when the first planting was done and the hands had rested for a moment, the villagers gathered to count the names. Not crops, not coins, but the names of those who had not seen the thaw. Father Elric kept the ledger in the chapel's north chest, bound in cracked leather, its corners smoothed by decades of solemn fingers. It was brought out only once a year during the counting and handled with reverence. The bell tolled once in the late morning, clear, slow, and firm. Edith heard it while hanging cloth to dry on the line outside the cottage. She paused. the wind tugging gently at the fabric, and looked toward the chapel. "It's time," she said to Ansel, who sat nearby carving a small wooden horse. He stood and tucked it into his pocket. Osric, now walking short distances with a carved cane, nodded. "Go, speak my name with the living." The chapel was filled by midday. No song was sung. No sermon was given. Instead, each family stepped forward one by one to speak the names they had lost. Breatha stood with a tremor in her voice and whispered, "Lena Thornley." A pause. Then, from a voice in the back, "Torvin the Thatcher." "Gerwin of the Mill," someone else said. Edith stood when it was her turn, not because she had lost someone that winter, but because she had promised to speak for the Reeves. Mother, who had passed in the early days of the snow, her name nearly forgotten in the flurry of survival. "Agnes Morland," Edith said softly. Each name was added by Father Elric with a careful hand. No titles, no age, just the name and the mark of the season, taken in the winter of the long silence. The chapel grew warm with bodies and sunlight, but the weight in the room was that of frost returned to memory. When the final name was spoken, the priest closed the book and laid it gently upon the altar. "Let us remember them," he said, "not only in grief, but in the lessons they gave us, in how we share, how we warm, how we watch." The villagers did not cheer, nor applaud. They only stood in silence together, holding space for those whose chairs sat empty. Outside, the children played beneath the yew, unaware or simply unburdened. Ansel sat with Edith on the chapel steps, turning the wooden horse over in his hands. "Will someone speak my name one day?" he asked. Edith looked at him, brushing hair from his brow. "Yes, but not for many, many winters. Do you think they hear us?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think they feel remembered." Osric joined them as the crowd thinned. He sat slowly, breath catching, but his eyes clear. "There are more names than I thought," he said. Edith nodded. "There always are." The ledger would be returned to its chest, locked away until the next counting. But the names remained on lips, in stories, in pauses around the hearth. That evening, Ansel carved a second horse. He handed it to Breatha with quiet ceremony. "For Lena," he said, "so she has something to play with in the summer." Breatha did not cry, but she kissed his forehead. The days grew warmer, the paths dried, and the work of living resumed, not with celebration, but with rhythm. New seeds were sown, windows were unshuttered. The chickens laid more eggs. The goats were led into fields where green had returned. Yet in every corner of Wythcombe, there was a space that held the winter still. A chair not sat in, a cloak not worn, a bowl not filled. Loss, in the medieval world, was not sudden, but lingering. Grief took root not only in heartache, but in necessity, because those who had gone often left behind work that needed doing. Fields to tend, shoes to mend, stories to finish. So others stepped. In Wulfric took over the thatching work Torvin had once done. Merowyn helped tend Gerwin's millstone. Edith began baking twice as often to cover for a neighbour who could no longer stand long enough to knead. And in doing so, the names lived again, through hands, through kindness, through tasks once done, in other bodies. Father Elric wrote something new in the back of the ledger that year. Not a name, but a phrase. Survival is not only breath, but memory carried forward. When Edith saw it later that spring, she added her own words beneath, and love, even after silence. That night, Osric sat by the hearth, watching the fire burn low but clean. "Do you think they know?" he asked. "Who?" Edith replied. "The ones who didn't make it." She looked into the flames. "I think they knew we tried. I think they'd want us to go on." He nodded slowly. And Ansel, already asleep by the door, held both carved horses in his hands, one for now and one for memory. Outside, The grass grew higher than it had in years. And beneath the stars, the name spoken that morning stirred in the wind. Spring did not arrive all at once, but one morning, the light did not leave. That was how the villagers knew it had truly come. Not because of any single blossom or burst of warmth, but because the sun lingered, longer than it had in months. It clung to the hills like a golden shawl, stretching shadows out slowly, kindly, as if trying to touch everything winter had once hidden. Edith noticed first while drawing water at dusk. The sky, which had turned to indigo far too early through all the long months before, now remained a dusky lavender. The birds did not retreat as quickly. The breeze carried a sweetness she had nearly forgotten. Earth warmed enough to breathe. She looked up and whispered, "You're staying." From that evening on, the village changed. Children stayed outdoors longer. Doors remained open. Herbs were hung in windows to dry. The sheep, freshly sheared, bleated lazily in fields greening by the hour. Even the chapel's stonework, worn and grey, seemed to glow faintly in the late light. Ansel helped Osric sit in the garden most evenings now. The old man's strength had not fully returned, might never, but the warmth restored colour to his face, made his voice steadier. "I thought we'd lose the light this year," he said one evening, but it was only hiding. Edith planted radishes that morning, then carrots. She laid her hands to the soil and spoke softly, as the women of her line had done for generations. "Grow gently. Stay true. Remember the ones who buried you." Planting was not just an act of food, it was a covenant, a promise renewed between earth and hand. In medieval life, each seed was hope and heritage, nourishment and memory. The village leaned into that promise. Breitha began rebuilding her garden wall, with stones carried from the riverbank. Wulfric offered free sharpening to every woman who had kept a hearth alive through the worst days. Tom, walking with a stick now, hosted the first market day of spring, a small affair of jars, bundles, and hopeful laughter. Father Elric gave a sermon about St. Bridget and the blessing of flame that warms without burning. "It is not the end of hardship," he said, "but it is the end of waiting." On that same Sunday, Ansel planted his own seed, an apple pip taken from a shriveled winter fruit. He buried it beside the thorn bush, where the birds still sang, and marked the spot with 2 stones. "For the winter's still to come," he said. Edith kissed his brow, and that night they cooked their first true stew in weeks, rich with greens, garlic, and the last of the barley saved for the turning. The scent filled the home like music. They ate slowly, with reverence. The season turned, but the memory of winter did not melt away. It stayed in the way the people greeted each other, with a little more softness. It lived in the way they rationed flour, even when the sacks were full. It lingered in every cottage where someone had not come back. Yet there was no bitterness in the remembering, only quiet wisdom. In time, the nettles were picked and turned into broth. The wild garlic was braided into ropes. The barley grew strong in the fields, and the earth that had once groaned beneath the thaw now held firm under bare feet. Children raced down lanes lined with dandelions. The well no longer froze. The bell rang brighter. One evening, Father Elric opened the chapel to those who wished to offer a prayer of thanks, not for miracles, but for endurance. Each person lit a small taper and spoke no words, only knelt and let the silence carry their thoughts. The chapel was filled with a golden hush, a flickering sanctuary of soot and survival. Edith lit hers and thought of her mother, of Leanie Thornley, of Agnes Morland, of names and nights and choices made in the dark. When the taper guttered, she felt lighter. On the final night of the planting moon, the village held a dance, a true one, with ribbons and bread and laughter. Ansel wore a crown of woven green and gave Breitha the wooden horse he had carved in secret. a new one, with flowers etched along its sides. Osric tapped his cane in time with the rhythm, eyes misty. Edith spun once in the circle, letting her hair down for the first time in months. And when she stopped, breathless, she looked toward the trees and saw something rare. Fireflies. Soft sparks. In the evening air, life returning. When the stars came out that night, no one retreated too soon. They stayed beneath the sky, telling stories. Not of snow, not of hunger, but of warmth and what it means to remember. In the seasons that followed, the story of that winter became a part of Wythcombe's marrow. It was told not in sorrow, but in truth, as warning, as tribute, as testament. Years later, Ansel would become a keeper of stories, writing down what had only ever been spoken. He began with a single line. There was a winter when the light nearly forgot us, but we lit fires and told tales and waited. And that, dear listener, is where we leave them. The village that survived the snow, the hearth that never went out, the boy who planted an apple tree, and the people who remembered that winter not as a curse, but as the season they found one another again. Outside your window now, the wind may stir and the air may cool. But remember this, no matter how long the winter, the light always stays longer the next time it returns.